Me is extremely pleased to have Dr. Shankar Kumar today. So I'll give an official introduction, right? So namaste, everyone. Again, thank you for joining from around the globe. For some people, it's morning. For some people, it's the evening, afternoon, whatnot. So thank you for making time. Grateful for that. Dr. Shankar Kumar joined the Hindu College as an assistant professor in the Department of History in 2006. His current title is associate professor, right? He used to work with the Confederation of Indian Industry, and since he was awarded the Junior Research Fellowship by the University Grants Commission, he decided to pursue his work in the subject in areas that fascinated him, which is history. And he completed his MPhil and then his PhD from the Department of History at the University of Delhi. He is interested in transdisciplinary studies, as we see from the title of the talk today, and his research areas and interests. Today's talk is going to be ancient Indian medicine, right? Focused on ancient Indian medicine. So medicine in ancient India is what we are going to be talking about today. He's going to be presenting on that. Dr. Kumar has a long list of publications and actually very interesting lectures, like about 70 of them on history and Indian culture, which have been nationally televised, right? He has delivered various talks around the globe. His books and co-authored books, co-edited books, and books are available, of course, for readers. Another thing I want to mention, which is of a passion to me too, is he is interested in cultivating young minds and is interested in women's education and rights, which is evident by his CV. So he served on the Women's Education Board and also on the task force, which enabled young redefining education for the youth. So welcome, Dr. Kumar, and we will get you started. One of my first questions for you, sir, is how did this come about? How did your interests come about? And with that, we can carry forward, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope my audio is getting across to you. Right. First of all, thank you for giving me this platform. And I saw some of the videos that you have done before on this, and they were extremely dense, incisive, and very useful. This platform on Indology, to be precise and specific, is very much, I would say, topical, particularly for researches happening in India, because of some of the reasons that I will outline. But coming to your question, certainly I was a science student up to +2 level, as we call it in India, and thereafter switched over to history and ended up doing research, PhD, on early Indian medicine. That's because something that I discovered later in my researches as to why it happened to me. Because if you look at the literature that constitutes the corpus of early Indian medicine, namely Charak Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, and Vagbhat's 2 books, Ashtang Hriday Sangrah and Ashtang Hriday Samhita, you know that there is a lot of penetration of cultural data in it. I will explain during the course of my today's interaction that early Indian medicine is more about the lifestyle, the culture of the subcontinent, and medicinal, as we understand it today, scientific hard data is interspersed in a barrage of cultural data that we discover in these treatises. And so in my house, I very often saw my parents using sutras to convey things about eating habits, about sleeping habits, about drinking habits. And my father was a botanist, professor in botany, and yet he would, talk about some things in couplets, which perhaps was bequeathed to him as part of culture. And that would explain as to how the food should be, which food is light, which food is not good, which food should be avoided in the night, and how water should be taken in, and all kinds of things. They are part of the culture. And the Ayurvedic principles, for a long time, perhaps was communicated to us, the Indians, in oral form as well. And I will talk about it, that the sheer pressure or constraint or the norm of presenting even the medicinal principles and prescriptions in oral form had some textual constraints, and that had something to do with the way Ayurvedic treatises talk about these medicinal principles. At times, synonyms are used. At times, it leads to some degree of difference. At times, even aberration, right, from the original meaning, because under the compulsion of presenting it in oral form, which could be recited, which could be memorized, which could very easily be bequeathed to generations, some terms had to be tweaked. And that is something that has happened in the course of the survival of Ayurvedic principles across millennia in Indian history. And so, as your question goes, as to what drew me here, was these things came to me. And despite my father being a botanist, he would not explain it in terms of biomedicinal principles that otherwise we generally tend to believe should be backing up these medicinal principles or these Ayurvedic principles. It's a fallacy. It's a fallacy. It's a trap into which we fall into even today. In order to embellish the efficacy of Ayurvedic medicines or formulations, we tend to use the principle of its biomedicinal appropriateness, which is wrong. That's not the way Ayurveda is conceived of. That's not the way it was ever prescribed. It happened around, say, 19th century under colonial conditions. I'll talk about it. Sorry, Anjali, you are muted.
No, the floor is yours. Yes, please do carry on with the presentation. This is very interesting, and thank you for answering the question. Absolutely.
Okay, so let me first outline my scheme of this interaction for the next 40-45 minutes or so. This is about early Indian medicine. This is not about the pharmacopoeia of Ayurveda. This is more about the cultural conditions under which health was conceived of in a particular way. Healing was conceived of in a particular way in Indian history. Across millennia, the way it transformed, the way it adapted over the changing centuries, across 2 millennia, more than 2 millennia actually. And something drastic that happened around the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, and perhaps it is happening even today, because of the colonial conditions, and subsequently even in independent India, we have these compulsions operating because of the commerce associated with it, because of the competition with which it is pitted against. The Ayurvedic medicines and prescriptions are pitted against the allopathic medicines, as we call it in India, or the Angrezi dawai, as we call it. And that brought about distortions of its own kind, distortions that led to fair degree of sanitization of the early Indian treatises, medical treatises, what we call the classical Indian medical treatises. Actually, there are three big figures in early Indian medicine that we understand as classical form of early Indian medicine: Charak, Shushruta, and Vagvat. Charak you can date, say, in the first couple of centuries or the 2 centuries preceding the beginning of the Common Era. Shushruta is dated little later, say a couple of centuries after Charak. And finally, you have Vagvat's 2 treatises that came about perhaps around 6th century AD, 6th century Common Era. So they constitute the 3 biggies of early Indian medicine, and they are understood as the classical Indian medical treatises, all written in Sanskrit, and some adopt only verse form, some adopt the combination of verse and prose, and that's how it goes. Vagvat, the third one, who wrote around 6th century Common Era, self-avowedly declares that he is doing nothing more than systematizing the works already done by Charak and Shushruta. And by the way, if you are interested to see the live form of the practice of Ayurveda, we generally are reminded of some families, some Brahmin families, particularly in Kerala, who still practice it. And even their children remember entire Vagvat's work by rote. And that is because Vagvat wrote it with that purpose. So he doesn't claim, quite unlike other scholars in early India, who would not even reveal their own human identity in writing a particular text and let it be shrouded in divine mystery. Quite unlike that, Vagvat is very upfront and is saying that he is doing nothing more than simplifying and making it easy for the Ayurvedic practitioners to use what Charak and Shushruta had already written about. So what is popular today as a practicing craft of Ayurveda in India is attributed more to Vagvat rather than the earlier 2 authorities, Charak and Shushruta. Okay, so that apart, in the present scheme of my discussion, I would first talk about what happens around 19th century and early part of the 20th century, the colonial context as we understand it, to this corpus that we understand as early Indian medicine. Thereafter, we will see as to what this Oriental treatment or Indological treatment of early Indian medicine has done to the corpus of knowledge that constituted healing practices in early India, and explore whether it is an appropriate entry point to study the past practices or early Indian practices of healing. We will see it betrays 2 trends, both radically opposite. And thereafter, we will try to use a better or more appropriate entry point, avoiding that Oriental pitfall or avoiding that window or entry point to understand India's deep past from these Oriental studies or Indological studies, rather use the precedents of what constituted the classical early Indian medicine, say from Harappa, Vedic times, coming to the times of Buddha, that is 6th century before Common Era, and going on to the times when these treatises, iconic treatises of Charak and Shushruta, were probably penned, were probably compiled. And this will allow us to have a view of India's early Indian medical practices, which is historically consistent and unadulterated or uncompromised, non-compromised by the Oriental treatment that it received in the 19th and early 20th century. And thereafter, towards the concluding part, we will see if we can make some sense out of it, or we will have some more realistic proportion and frame within which we should be using whatever we understand as medicinal practices or medicinal data or even pharmacopoeia or the principles that underpin Ayurvedic treatments and so forth. So having spelled out my stream of discussion, let's come to the first part. And that is the modern way of doing history that constitutes the curricular history of schools and also colleges and higher institutions in the present times. Actually, the outline, the contours of this were a byproduct of colonial times. The rules of the discipline, in fact, the subject history got disciplined and started being referred to as a discipline, say around the 19th century. It had its own grammar, it had its own rules, it has its own do's and don'ts. It had to be sequentially arranged, chronologically arranged, evidence-based. Some causal explanations had to be given for assertions. So that's the way we tend to study the mainstream history in India today, and that's the norm the world over. And it's a new phenomenon. This is not the way we looked at our past or our health, or this is not the paradigm that was used by the by these authors like Charak and Shushruta to outline whatever they did. Now, when it happened in India, the political reality was that we were a colony. And alongside the Western medicine premised on biomedical principles, molecular constitution, and so forth, that had also started capturing the Indian market of health and healing. And there were practitioners, the Vaidyas of Ayurvedic tradition, who perhaps were hit hard. And they saw some opportunities here. They fought back. And there are some wonderful, fairly sophisticated works by Kavita Shivramakrishnan, David Hardiman. Shivramakrishnan has worked in Punjab, colonial Punjab, Hardiman particularly in Bengal area and so forth. And they track as to what was happening around this traditional medicine and so forth in the colonial context. And they said that, the sheer reality, the sheer political reality and commercial reality of 19th century Punjab and Bengal dictated these changes. The traditional medicine and practices encapsulated in, say, Ayurveda or Unani, Tibba medicine, and so forth, they were very diverse. It was pluralistic. And by the time we reach 19th century and see this contest, see this tussle going on between the Angrezi Dawai and the traditional ways of healing, we find that the entire practice, the entire plurality, the heterogeneity of the traditional medical practices were homogenized. It were made unitary. It were made to look more coherent. Coherent that made it more amenable to be taught, say, in universities and colleges that were giving new opportunities for the practitioners of Ayurveda or these Vedyas to transform their craft into a new kind of profession already, lucrative profession. The pre-formulated, bottled, or packaged drugs, now, that had never been part of the Ayurvedic tradition, but it was happening with labels. There are advertisements in newspapers. There are journals. There is a network of traditional practices of Ayurveda and Unani medicine and so forth that is happening. So it's towing the lines of the way Western medicine actually operated in India and the way it transacted its business. And that completely transformed the face and I would say even the substance, pith and substance of the traditional medicine in India. And it sanitized the corpus, the traditional corpus of Indian medicine. It weaned it off the inconsistencies that otherwise were there. And it's there in every traditional medicinal practices, right? But under the pressure, under the duress of sheer survival in the commercially active market, they had to do it. And therefore, quite a few scholars who have extensively worked on early Indian medicine, I would just quote Muhlenbelt, who has brought out wonderful 5 volumes of early Indian medical literature. First 2 volumes, of course, I have read extensively. And he says that this is completely a new thing that we are seeing. It does not even warrant it being called Ayurveda. And so it perhaps would be more apt to refer to them as Navya Ayurveda or Neo Ayurveda. And it is this phase of Ayurveda that has caught up the imagination of even the Western audience, and it survives till date as something which is even fashionable. But should we be using this sanitized, canonized version? In fact, it is around this time that whatever constituted the corpus of Charak Samhita was elevated to the level of classical unitary form of early Indian medicine, and so that it could be taught in Indian universities. A curriculum could be made out of it. The conventional 8 sthanas in which the entire material, be it charak or shushrut, is organized into, were named in such a way, like anatomy, physiology, midwifery, and so forth, so as to look very contemporary and comparable to Western medicine, right? So can we use these canonized versions of Charak Samhita and Shushruta Samhita to understand our deep past in terms of what was happening as part of health and healing in early India, right? So I now come to the second part of my presentation to explore the appropriateness of this entry point. In fact, there has been a fascinating debate and a lot of historians have been writing about it. Quite a few young scholars who have shot into a fair degree of prominence on account of very assertive tone in which they write about the inappropriateness of the colonial history to understand the past. For example, J. Sai Deepak has come out with some book on India's past, and he wants to come up to the constitutional history of India as well. And in fact, he was at one of the seminars where I was also there, and we got to comment on each other's take on this. And there are quite a few others. In fact, the point that I'm trying to make here is that this colonial, I would say, organization or colonial knowledge creation that happened in 19th century at the behest of, I would say, earlier it was the fast fading tradition of missionaries who were writing about India's past. Then you have the Indologists, whose main concern was language, grammar, and so forth. And I would say Orientalists. So the way they were creating knowledge about India's past now appears to be deeply compromised in terms of the intent with which they were writing about India's past or studying about India's past. It has led to two trends. One, of course, it equipped several scholars with very incisive scientific tool with which they could cut through quite a few extravagant claims that were made in, say, biographical accounts or even otherwise about India's past, and even critique post-colonial writings with that model, with that heuristic device. But at the same time, the other extreme is that the sheer fact that it was discovered beyond dispute that this colonial knowledge creation about India's deep past was heavily compromised to the extent that they were just rendering it impossible for the future generation to use it as a vantage point or the entry point to studies India's deep past, led to some kind of a total rejection of what colonial history had to say about India's past. So on the one hand, it equips us with some incisive ways to analyze things. On the other, on the other, complete rejection of what was created during the colonial times as India's past, as India's deep past. And it lays the ground bare for both. And therefore, Indian history writing is in a peculiar situation. That is what I alluded to, Anjali, about your platform, that it is being spoken about. One is like even the leftist historians or the rightist historians, even if you see the extreme, the polarity of viewpoints in Indian history writing today, both use this colonial writings as the punching bag, right? So even the left historians would critique it, would demolish and almost pulverize the narrative produced during the colonial times. And the right-wing historians would simply begin with this premise that, look, this is so inappropriate, this is so compromised with imperial interests. Why are we even talking about it? Let's go afresh and write a different history and write a different history of India's past, right? And these are the two trends that you get to see today in Indian history writing. So coming back to early Indian medicine, what do I do with it? So trapped in this inappropriateness of the colonial history as the entry point when the texts that I have to study, say Charak Samhita, Shushruta Samhita, it were during the colonial times, it were during the 19th century and early part of 20th century that they were canonized. So I mean, to a reader today, it appears in that form, and that is inappropriate. That's not the right entry point to understand deep history of India. So what do I do? So it's better to go to rather jump over this and not use them as the entry point, rather understand chronologically what was happening in Harappan times in relation to health and healing, what is happening in the Vedic period in terms of health and healing, what is happening in the later Vedic period, say Atharva Ved, what was happening in 6th century BC, what Buddha was doing, what these Charana Vedyas were doing, and how suddenly in the classical treatises we find some kind of a systematization, etiologically sophisticated, systematized presentation of early Indian medical practices that we understand as Ayurveda today. So using this perspective, I think is more rewarding. And it is using this that I now go along for the next 20 minutes or so. So if you look at the Harappan period, well, we don't have access to the written material. In any case, even if we are able to decipher those scripts, the sheer volume of the scripts, the written stuff is so little that there isn't much that can be revealed. But through the pictographic evidences that we have in seals and sealings, and there are some archaeological evidence of perforated jars and so forth, that lends itself to some kind of a presumption, or we can assume that their functional usage had something to do with health, medicine, healing, or even divine healers, right? So overall, the context cannot be anything beyond magico-religious, at least at the given stage, at the present stage of information that we have for the Harappan period. Coming to what we understand as the Vedic period, well, in the early Vedic period, it continues to be, I would say, ritual bound and magico-religious constraints are not broken through. But by the time we come to the Atharva Ved, one of the 4 iconic Vedas that we talk of, we are in for some bit of a change in the trajectory, change in the way perhaps health was looked at. There is certainly a greater concern with the mundane affairs of everyday life in Atharva Ved. It is the supernatural and the benevolent and malevolent forces are at play. They are being spoken of abundantly, but the medical data related to diseases, related to possible cures, they are all spread across Atharva Ved in all its 20 books. Although they are not systematized as one section, as one chapter or one khand in Atharvedic literature, but they are abundantly there. And there is also some, I would say, incipient empirico-rational principles entering into the way health and healing was seen. You know, in Ayurveda, Ayurveda is obsessed with taxonomy, the penchant to classify everything, to classify food, to classify plant, to classify animals, to classify weather, to classify climate, to classify everything, body constitution, ras, guna, dosh, and so forth. And you find, some baby steps toward these classifications being taken in Atharva Ved. For example, diseases, while being spoken of, are classified as diseases that are giving us manifest symptoms and diseases that come with unmanifested symptoms. During the COVID times, we used this word symptomatic and asymptomatic quite a few times, and actually it reminds us of that. This classificatory principle is very much present in Atharva Ved, right? And this is something which is absent in earlier texts. I still am saying that in Atharva Ved, the overall magico-religious constraints are not breached through, but as I said, that incipient principles of empirico-rational perspective are very much visible. And there is a brilliant work by Kenneth Zaysk on asceticism and early Indian healing traditions, which largely talks of the Buddhist traditions that could have contributed a lot. What went on to be elaborated and systematized subsequently as the classical Sanskrit corpus of Charak and Shushrut. But even before that, and this is my assertion, even before that, the name Charak itself, if you explore this, because historians have written profusely about the exact chronological bracket into which we can situate Charak Samhita and Shushrut Samhita. And while looking at these sources, what I discovered is that the root word for Charak is Chara. And there are many Charaks in Indian tradition. Shushrut are a few. It's more uncommon kind of a name, but Charaks are many. And Chara, even in the Vedic tradition, prior to the Buddhist incoming, I would say, Char is simultaneously used as a verb as well as a noun, right? As in a subjective sense as well as in objective sense. So as verb, it would be like to wander around. So char is like the area where you move around, right? And char is also as verb something that you eat, food that you consume. जैसे जानवरों का चारा, the root word is char. And char is also, for example, vicharan. In Hindi, we call it vicharan karna. Vicharan is the area where you move around. So it's a place, it's a habitat, as well as it's food. It's food that you consume. Now, if you look at it that way, this word gives you a very good insight into what went on to become a central principle or the central principle of Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia and principle of treatment. Although I would not risk this, Ayurveda is composed of several principles. And it's not easy to identify one as the central principle of Ayurvedic treatment. Nevertheless, if you ask the practitioners and scholars about choosing one, if you have to, perhaps they will choose one or two that I'm talking about. One is that whatever you consume as food and wherever you consume as part of geography is of utmost importance in Ayurveda. In fact, of the several classifications or taxonomies that Ayurveda does, and it is spread across Charak's work and Shushruth's work, you'll find one classification which is, and I wrote about it during the COVID times, using the same classification of ecology underpinning Ayurvedic treatment to understand the variance of fatalities of an epidemic, the COVID epidemic, the COVID pandemic rather. In fact, I wrote it for the Outlook, and it still holds the central idea that I talked of there. Data-wise, it still holds true. What was it? In Ayurveda, you will find that the ecological reality of the subcontinent is classified into jungle and anu. Now, jungle is that dry area where rainfall is less, plain area, not mountainous terrain, but plain area, largely plain area. You can think of Rajasthan, Delhi, Punjab, Gujarat area, and some parts of Madhya Pradesh. In fact, if you, on the map of India, if you draw a vertical line, in the middle of it, the western half, largely barring the coastal areas, would be jungle area. The eastern half would be Anup area. In jungle area, the vegetation is very scarce. You have some, thorny bushes. Then you have deer. You don't have rhinoceros and buffaloes in jungle area. Whereas if you contrast that with what is written about in Ayurvedic texts as Anup area is that area which is rainfall rich, which is moisture rich, which has hilly terrains, which is not plain area, where vegetation is thick almost all across the year. You have green patches. So the eastern half of India would perhaps be the better candidate to be understood as what in Ayurveda is described as Anup area, right? So this classification is there. And in fact, if you look at the prescriptions in terms of any malady in Ayurveda, it would say that, okay, a person who is having some distortions, say, in the equilibrium of kapha, vayu, and pitta, need to be compensated by the contraries. And what are those contraries? That if he has amplified kapha or pitta or vayu, then he needs to be given food that are of opposite quality to bring it down. That's the principle that is at work. So it is the contrary of opposites, striving for some kind of an equilibrium. And this principle, this central principle of prescription in Ayurveda, you can find it coming from the sheer meaning, the ambivalence that is surrounding the meaning of Charak. And no wonder Charak is the first to systematize this. So when in a Charak, it is the habitat in which you live and the animals, the meats that you consume, say in a dry land. So anyone or any species that consumes stuff in jungle area will be having some properties. Their meat would be imbued with some properties of kapha, vayu, and pitta. And an animal which is wandering or which is moving around, char, again, in the another sense of the term, and consuming as food, again, the meaning is char. Say in Anup area will have contrary qualities. So their needs would have contrary qualities, and it can be compensated as medicine. So if something goes up, then give them stuff from jungle area. If something goes wrong, give them stuff from Anup area. And that is how it works. So the sheer semantic ambivalence around the word charak or its root word char gives a very fruitful insight into what perhaps went on to become a central principle of Ayurveda, treating melodies through properties of contraries, right? And thereafter, this was my central point. That's why I devoted a lot of time to explain this. Thereafter, of course, in terms of institutional healing, with which Ayurveda is also identified, those practices are very much there in the ascetic tradition of Buddhists around 6th century BC. Remember, even the mode of worship in India transformed around 6th century BC. Even in the Vedic tradition, you don't find priests going to Himalayas or sannyas to seek God and knowledge. It happened around, it started happening, knowledge or seeking knowledge as a form of worship became fashionable from 6th century BC onwards in India. Before that, it was more sacrifice-led, sacrificial, right? Yajna and so forth. And there, it is not only limited to, as Kenneth Zayas would make us believe, it is not only limited to the precincts of Buddhism, but even outside it, even in the Atharvedic tradition, we have reference to Charan Vadyas. And Charan Vadyas are described as earning their livelihood by wandering and offering medicines as healing tablets or healing drugs. And they also are supposed to be in conversation with several other people in order to further improvise their knowledge, healing practices. So there is a tradition that can serve as precursor to what went on to become systematized as Ayurvedic corpus in its classical form. And that happened around the turn of the Common Era in the works of Charak and Shushruta. Now, so institutionally, the Buddhist Sangha actually had the provision of a medicine house in each of the Sanghas. Gautam Buddha himself, he had this pompous notion about himself that he is the biggest Visaj, right? He's the biggest healer, right? So he had this air about himself that he's good at offering medicines to those who need it. So that tradition is a contributory factor. And all these traditions actually serve. And then there are several other principles related to anatomy and the way dissections are carried out, the way human parts are understood. Buddhist disciples and bhikshus are trained to concentrate on a dead, decaying body post-death, dead bodies floating in the river, and they are supposed to look at it. It simultaneously does two things. One is it induces a sense of detachment, which was part of their training from worldly, mundane things. Second was inadvertently, maybe, that they also got to see what they otherwise couldn't. The human anatomy, right? And there are vivid description of how birds and insects are eating upon the human body and different parts and so forth. So, the way in Western tradition we say that during the Renaissance period, the Italian painters actually dissected human body, dead bodies, just to understand the muscles, the location of muscles and veins, so that they could depict it vividly in their sculpture and paintings. This was not done with some medical intent. That came later. Harvey came later, who discovered that it is the blood veins that transports blood to different parts of human body. But maybe through serendipity, they understood about human anatomy. And this is what seems to be happening to these Buddhist bhikshus as well. So all these traditions actually coalesced. And around the turn of the Common Era, we find a very sophisticated etiological presentation, a scholastic presentation in the treatises that we understand as Charak Samhita and Sushruta Samhita. And what is happening thereafter? Thereafter, quite a few historians talk about this, that there was some compulsions of the textual classical Sanskrit grammar and style of presentation. The sheer fact that it was now presented as a text, as a treatise in a language that had its own grammar, idioms, and style of presentation, and the pressure that it had to be rendered easy for oral transmission. All these led to some interferences. And synonyms, antonyms, metonyms are used in subsequent elaborations. And even some of the commentators, the tikakars of these texts talk about it. They substitute a particular word with something else, with a synonym, with a metonym, and so forth, in order to render it more contemporary and also from the orality point of view, so that it could be sung, it could be remembered easily, right? And that led to quite a few confusions as well, at times distortions also. For example, there is a triad of Jungle, Anup, and Shal. Shal here standing for mountains. Now, why mountains are coming? It's because water had to be brought in. And then water, what happens to water? Water is brought in for reference because rivers had to be brought in. Nade. And why rivers? Then again, two kinds of waters. Which water is more beneficial health-wise, which water is not so beneficial? So running water, water which is coming from mountains, descending and striking against rocks, splitting into splashes, that is better quality water as compared to stagnant water. I mean, even scientifically, this is the way we regard it as true. This is all there in Ayurveda, but the normative value is coming in to interfere. And what happens is, like, in early part of, say, Ayurvedic tradition, you will find a lot of emphasis given to the river Indus or Sindhu. Why? Because it is running from north to south and it is flowing westward, right? By the time these tikakars, these commentators are writing, Ganga has become more sacred, right? And Ganga doesn't flow from east to west. It flows from west to east. Now that had to be reconciled. So by the time we reach 12th century, 13th century, we find these commentators toiling hard to somehow account for this. And they say that no, water coming from west to east is also good, right? So they are also very much there. And to understand them from the window of what Orientalists did or what Indologists did, what the colonial context did, is like it was all weaned off these inconsistencies and presented in a very coherent, systematic, unitary way. This is not the way in which healing and medicine transacted its journey across millennia in a deep past of India. So one will have to move beyond this and take a more, I would say, historically consistent understanding of the principles the conditions, the circumstances under which this corpus of literature that we understand as classical Indian medicine actually emerged and grew and modified and adapted. So by and large, I think I have exhausted my time, and I would love to receive questions if there are any. So that is it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to let folks type up their question. I've enabled the chat function so they can do that. Quick, and while you get a sip of water and whatnot, a couple of questions. And first, I see Professor Himanshu Roy, so thank you very much for joining. And I'm grateful to him because he's the one who kind of made introductions with you. So I'm glad to see that name pop up. Quickly, while we wait for other folks to put their questions in the chat, Dr. Kumar, think about the opportunities and the challenges, or the other way around. Think about the main challenges and the opportunities for this field to move forward. I know many of your students might have joined too. So a little bit of a philosophical question for you about how you see kind of this field moving forward. And I see some comments coming in while we look at those. Yes, the YouTube link, the Facebook link, the Twitter, all of this is in the chat also for those who are interested. Seemaji, thank you for saying yes, well explained. Any questions from the audience? And I can even allow people to ask verbally if you're interested, if you raise hand or indicate. Actually, I've allowed, yeah, folks can unmute themselves too if you have questions.
Yeah, Shankarji, it's a very good lecture, really quite enlightening. I'm Santosh Kumar speaking, right? My question that what you described about Ayurveda, right, it mostly reflects what happens in northern India, right? Because rivers and all these jungles, etc. But if we look at geographically about the Ayurvedic tradition of treatment, why is it the case that in South it is Kerala, if you look at Ayurvedic treatment in overall medical treatment, so Ayurveda dominates in overall treatment as compared to any other region. So is there any specific reason that why Kerala has been successful in preserving the Ayurvedic knowledge which was developed long back since the time that you described? And why is it not so the case in other regions? I mean, just your comments.
Yeah, thank you for this very perceptive remark and observation. And I had briefly alluded to it that, around 6th century Common Era, when Bhagavad is writing Ashtang Hridaya Sanghita and Ashtang Hridaya Sangra, Samagra. I think the Chinese pilgrim actually mentions about the popularity way back in 7th century AD that there is someone who has become very popular, who presents Indian medical tradition in 8 khandas or in 8 parts, and that's the conventional way in which the corpus is presented in the works of Bhagavad. And he alludes to its popularity in the area, which is Deccan and South India, right? And as I said, that today the post-19th century creation of knowledge about deep past, we tend to accord more value to Charak and Shukla. But if you take a historically consistent understanding of India's past, you will find that more than Charak and Shukla, it is Bhagavad's work that made Charak and Shushut more popular. Right? So it's coming from there, all right. But in terms of making it popular, it's like, there are several, Puritans who sing ghazals and so forth. But it took Jagjit Singh to come and, make it popular. So that way, this thing is happening in Deccan area, in Kerala area, and certainly, mere happening of something, say, as early as 6th century, 7th century AD will not suffice. Of course, there could be a very strong family tradition of practitioners who somehow were still very recalcitrant in terms of changing during the 19th century. There could be several other reasons for that, which I have not explored. But I could offer one instance, which is part of my study period, that is 6th, 7th century. There could be several other contributory factors that allowed that tradition to stay afloat as a vibrant tradition, surviving to the present times. In fact, I met Professor Valiathan. He's a very renowned heart specialist. He's a doctor. He's a physician by profession, and has written very good works on Charak and Shushut at one of the seminars at Inside in Science Academy. I asked him this question and said that, if you want to really have some insight into the way it was practiced in the past, you can't understand it from the biomolecular efficacy of Ayurvedic drugs and formulations. I mean, they wouldn't give you the result. And after all, it's a ratification of Ayurvedic efficacy or Ayurvedic drugs efficacy from a principle that is not internal to it. You can't ratify the efficacy from principles that are not internal to it. So that can be had only when you actually meet some of these practicing Ayurvedic Vedyas, and quite a few of them are still there, unidentified, living in some kind of isolation in Kerala and some other parts of India. So they perhaps are better specimen of what Ayurveda actually entailed, rather than this transformed Navya Ayurveda face with which we are more familiar. I don't know whether I could. I mean, this is the best that I could do to your question.
Okay, it was quite insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Santoshi. I think Saurav Rao is next, and then Gayatri's next after that. So Sauravji, please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Thanks a lot. That was a wonderfully crafted presentation, sir. Actually, you talked about how this Orientalist misrepresentation of classical Ayurvedic texts. So my question is regarding was there any native attempt by the native Ayurvedic practitioners to do away with that Orientalist misrepresentation, and how far they were successful in doing away with that?
Yeah, I discovered Saurav asking me this question. Saurav himself has worked extensively on medicine, and he has looked at the modern timeline, I would say the colonial timeline of its unfolding, the way it did in colonial times. Saurav, I would rather say that this indigenous people, native as they are called in colonial records, they were part of this design. The canonization and catapulting of Charak's work or Shushut's work as the foundation of classical Indian medical tradition and practices actually is a byproduct of this. What I tried to explain in my lecture is that we should approach it little differently, right? It does not begin with them. There is a very rich substratum of medical practices that can serve as precursor to what went on to become a very systematized, etiologically sophisticated account in the works of Shushruta and Charak, right? And in the colonial period, the way the time that you are alluding to, in the colonial period, of course, there is this tussle, but these pluralistic traditional practitioners who did not get swayed by this competitive struggle between Angrezi Dawa and Ayurveda and Unani medicine and so forth, perhaps were on Hashia, were on the margins, right? And they might, and that is precisely the point I'm saying, that they are the more genuine, bequeathers, or they are the more genuine people who can still give you this insight. Otherwise, what colonial situation did is to completely transform and sanitize this practice of all its visible inconsistencies from a concern that is not even internal to Ayurveda. So I don't know if there were some efforts on their part to somehow resurrect the old tradition. At least I'm not aware of any such prominent effort. There might be some, but they have at least not assumed the mainstreamish, focus. Right. So again,
Thanks
I'm
a
trying
lot.
my best
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
okay.
This is part of the challenges, right? I mean, opportunities and challenges question, of course. Then we have Gayatri. Gayatri, would you like to ask, or do you want me to read your? There you are.
Okay. Sir, it was a very wonderful presentation. It was very illuminating. Thank you for it. I have some questions. Like traditionally, yoga has been practiced along with astrology and Ayurveda, yoga, and astrology. All three have almost gone together in terms of healing a person. Like it has been practiced like that. Now we have Ayurveda completely divorcing itself from all this. And we had some time back even Baba Ramdev calling astrology some mumbo jumbo, right? So how do we tackle this? And that is one question. The second one is we had things like Siddha medicines also. So how do we promote it, and how efficacy, what is the efficacy of Siddha medicines? So would you please illuminate?
Thank you, Gayatri, for this. Actually, this gives me an opportunity to dwell upon something that perhaps got missed out during my lecture. I told you about the 19th century conditions in which Ayurveda as a practice, as a healing practice, and even as a profession got completely transformed in the face of challenge that it was receiving from allopathic medicines. Allopathic norms and ways in which these medicines were sold commercially, they intruded into Ayurvedic way of transacting things, and bottling of drugs and formulations started happening, labeling them started happening, advertisements started going, and so forth. That had nothing to do with the holistic way in which Ayurveda, alongside yoga, as you mentioned, has transacted across millennia in India's past. Now, you can't bottle yogic posture and market it. It can't be stacked on pharmacies stacks. right? So they had to be pruned. And that is what is happening across 19th century. Things that were central to Ayurvedic practice. And as I said, that it is more a part of Indian culture. It happens in totality, right? There can't be a mass prescription of Ayurvedic drugs. Allopathic drugs are mass prescribed. I mean, if you have these symptoms, take this. Anywhere on the globe, that medicine would work, because the principle is biomolecular, right? In Ayurveda, the therapeutics is premised not on biomolecular principles, on something else. As I said while talking about char, that it is embedded in the geography and food, in the habitat and food, right? So if your habitat changes, and the things that you consume on that habitat, which are natural species growing on a particular habitat, then that pharmaceutical prescription of Ayurveda will not work, right? And that is why it is individually prescribed. Ayurvedic drugs are individually prescribed, and the Vaidyas would not reveal. That's the way it was practiced. Would not reveal it to others, because they would think that it's a skill that only he is having, right? It can't be taught as a curricular subject. But all these things had to be done in 19th century on account of concerns that are extra medical, right? And that is what has happened to Ayurveda. And therefore, quite a few practices and a holistic way in which this healing tradition survived in India actually got ruptured. And therefore, the byproducts or the canons produced in the 19th century period perhaps will not be a very appropriate entry point to understand what is happening in deep past, health included.
Thank you for that. Guys, any last questions? At this point, we're kind of getting to that mark, but I will take one more with Dr. Kumar's permission. Any last burning question that we can get in before we part today? Okay, so then Dr. Kumar, I'm going to plug my question in back again. Just leave us with something positive about the future, what you foresee. It can be an opinion for this field. Thank you.
Yeah. So one is that in one of the questions, I think Gayatri mentioned about Baba Ramdev talking about it, and you discover that he is very fond of saying this when he talks about his products, Vedic products, Patanjali and so forth. He reiterates time and again that it is testified by the modern scientific laboratories and so forth, and it has been found to be consistent with it, right? A genuine Ayurvedic practitioner will never do it. The principles on which Ayurveda is premised, the cosmologies that are brought into play in the absence of adequate anatomical understanding of human body, and yet they had to prescribe a drug which is efficacious. At times we also come across this assertion. Francis Zimmerman has talked about it, that in Ayurveda you don't have diagnosis. Actually, what we have in Ayurveda is prognosis. And prognosis is the study of the progression of a disease and also its recovery. And this is something that you will find in the oral tradition embedded in Indian culture. We talk about ye bukhar, adhaiya bukhar hai, adhai din ka bukhar. For the 2.5 days, it will come. First day, it will give you high temperature. Second day, it will give you maximum temperature. Third day, it will start subsiding and all kinds. So these are prognosis, not diagnosis, actually. And this can be understood. I mean, this is not to say only about Ayurveda. All pre-modern medical practices, Greek included. I mean, in the absence of awareness about human anatomy, they had to rely on cosmologies, central cosmological imageries to understand human body. I'll just give you one example, and that perhaps would be of some interest. You know, how digestion is understood in Ayurveda. The Sanskrit word for digestion is pacha. Okay, pachana, khana ka pachana, right? In Sanskrit, pach is also the word for cooking. Sita chawal pakati hai. So translation goes, Sita odanam pachati, right? So pakana, cooking, is also pach. And look at how, in the absence of anatomical understanding of what happens to food when we take it inside our body, how Ayurvedic practitioners try to understand it. They try to understand it through the imagery of cooking of food. So what happens in cooking? You collect the stuff, mix it, you know, sanyog and sansakar, and there is fire that cooks it, and then aroma comes out of it, you know, and that is how the essence of food is transformed into something else. So a good cook will transform the individual ingredient essence into something. He will metamorphose it, right? He will change it into, he will imbue the cooked food with qualities that are more than the mere aggregate of its ingredients, right? And what is also the word for bhook, or what happens in stomach, in the pate of human body, is jataragni. Right? Jataragni. So it's like, Ayurveda acharyas will tell you that immediately after taking food, don't drink cold water. Why? Because there is fire in the belly that will cook the food that you take. And then the ras will come out, the aroma will come out, which will be absorbed by different tissues, and the body will get its nutrients, and it will ultimately transform into oj and something. Right? There is a gender aspect to it. I'm not going into it. It will take another half an hour to explain that. But this is the cosmological imagery that is used, and this is happening everywhere across, say, Chinese medical tradition. I have looked at it. Egyptian medical tradition, Greek medical tradition. They are relying on cosmology. And some of these cosmological imaginations are also very, very common across civilizations, right? And that way, we were doing pretty well, right? So quite a few cosmological imageries that are central to Ayurveda is something whose reverberance you find in several other civilizations that were contemporary and even subsequent to the coming of Ayurveda. So coming to your question, Anjali, what's the way out? Well, the way out cannot be to superimpose a principle of scrutiny that is not internal to Ayurveda, the way it transacted its journey across millennia in Indian past. The good thing, as I said, something positive. The good thing is that Ayurveda, unlike the Greek medicine, that's lost now. I mean, it survived in residual form in the Islamic tradition, and subsequently, it's no more practicing, therapy anymore. But unlike these, Ayurveda is a practicing discipline, is a practicing profession, is a practicing craft, right? So it should not use the parameters and the scrutiny of a medical tradition that is outside it, that is the allopathy. the biomolecular anatomical way in which human body is conceived of. And you will see that wherever allopathic medicine, interventions, surgeries come to a roadblock, they are also trying for different paradigms. They are also trying for, I mean, they are like clueless. What do we do after this? How to understand this? How to understand a recovery which perhaps they themselves can't own on account of their biological or biomolecular insight of human health and so forth. And that's where this holistic way of looking at health and healing comes very handy, right? So it's a different way of looking at human well-being and human happiness. And there are a lot of cultural data stuffed into Ayurvedic practices. So perhaps for being happy, there has to be some cultural inputs as well. That's part of health. That's part of health. You can't divorce it. So the very restricted microscopic way in which probes are carried out in allopathy, in Western medicine, at times when they come to some kind of a roadblock, they understand the importance of holistic way in which the completely different paradigm in which health needs to be conceived. And Ayurveda comes very handy in such circumstances. So I think we should be building upon that tradition rather than towing the lines of the Western medicinal principles and always take a subservient, introverted position that, okay, we are also there kind of thing. It has a rich legacy. It has withstood the test of time and continues to the present times. And it has a different way of looking at health and wellness. And that's proving efficacious even in the modern times. And that is what should be built upon.
Thank you, sir, for connecting all of those dots. Yoga is going through the same thing right now, right? Kind of taking that biomedical lens to examine the efficacy of yoga. So Ayurveda is facing the same thing. So we see some of these challenges, but also kind of building our own lenses to examine, I think is very important.
Professor Himanshu Roy has raised his hand.
I know, I was just going to say, like, we can't close out without talking to him. So take it away, Professor Roy.
Nice to see you, sir. It's a privilege having you as my audience. Come on.
I'm happy that Shankar, you are here, and as usual, you speak very well. I have listened to you a couple of times, and it's nice that Anjali has brought you here. And my question was, which you have answered partly and even earlier, but just for the diaspora and the other audience, Ayurveda is a gift of, or a product of, if I am permitted to use the modern word of industrial society or the market society, of a pre-industrial society. Ayurveda is a result of pre-industrial society. The modern market economy and the industrial society, in this situation, do you think that Ayurveda is going to compete in the contemporary times and in the future, despite all kinds of problems and the holistic solution that Ayurveda provides, that you have been discussing about it? It's a question of competing with the transnational companies, and in a very typical rural way of a pre-industrial society. That's the question for you.
Glad, sir, that you asked this question again. It gives me some extra time to dwell upon something that perhaps I did not touch upon. And let me allegorically try to answer this question. Let me use an analogy. In fact, I have done a piece on this, and that's on cricket, the sport, cricket. Since you used, you virtually, prodded me to answer your question like this, since you use this word pre-industrial, and that's very appropriate. Of the several games that you and I see around us, and we are enamored by the charm of those games, be it football, lawn tennis, badminton, whatever, compared to cricket. And we in India, I mean, it's a national passion. Cricket is a national passion. Now, grammar of the game of cricket, rules and regulations of the game of cricket were also frozen in the pre-industrial times, quite unlike several other games that are the byproduct of the modern industrial time. So you will find this game of cricket, this original game of cricket, being at odds with several other games. Which game is played for 5 continuous days, and in our times when we were school kids, it used to be 6 days test matches with 1 day rest, right? Trousers and t-shirts and even rounded hats. 11 players spread all across the field doing nothing except fielding, and there's one batsman, and he runs the show, right? There, the dimension of a cricket field is unspecified. So hitting a century at Gaba is completely different from hitting a century at Firoz Shah Kotla here in Delhi. The ground itself is short. There is oval, cricket field, and so people would hit in a square side and get maximum sixes. Can you even think of a major sporting, major game in 21st century where the dimension of the arena is not fixed? This is so much at odds with the precision that the precision and timeliness that was accorded by the industrial society. All other games are consistent with the industrial ethos of precision, measurement, shortness of duration, and so forth. But cricket, the sheer fact that its rules were actually made before industrialization happened is redolent of pre-industrial ethos. Similar for Ayurveda. It's a pre-modern way of looking at health, and it has its efficacy that ran across centuries. And here comes, in the industrial times, another way of looking at health and wellness. Over the last 200 years of its transaction, it has also hit quite a few roadblocks, and they don't have any answer to it, right? And here is an alternative paradigm of looking at health, which may not be remedied through prescribed tablets in a day or two, but it has held us in good stead for 2 millennia before industrialization. And that has a value of its own. And so I would rather say that even in this competitive times, instead of commercially competing with the Western medicine in terms of the principles that are internal to Western medicines, we should rather learn to survive and continue using the principles on which this therapy, this health perspective itself is premised. That's an alternate way of looking at health and happiness. And remember, health is more of a kind of cultural visualization in Ayurveda, not confined to the biomedical conceptualization and imageries in which it is trapped in allopathic medicine. And we need alternatives. We need alternatives. It's not as if allopathy has come to answer all the maladies that plague us. So I would rather say, let it be. It has withstood the test of time, and it has proved efficacious. It may not be as quick, and over-the-counter medicines can't be sold in Ayurveda, but it's doing well otherwise, and it's very much embedded in the subcontinental culture. It's very Indic. It's very Indic to have such conceptualizations about health and wellness, and it lives in our households through folklores and through practices, despite the overwhelming presence of allopathic medicines. And I think you personally would vouch for this. I know. I'm done.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Yes, health is much more, not just absence of disease, right? It's a holistic concept. And even as we go through COVID and all the challenges that come with it, we know that looking towards our systems, towards the Indic systems, towards ancient India in terms of medicine, I think is the way forward. So thank you so much, Dr. Kumar, for joining us today, taking up the questions, explaining everything bit by bit, very scientific, might I add. And when I come to India, I definitely would like a chance to meet with you and talk to you. Same goes for Professor Roy. So thank you so much. Okay, thank you all for joining, and look out for the next announcement for when we have the next wonderful speaker. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.